Shalom bimroma, v'yaseh shalom aleinu. Shalom bimroma, v'yaseh shalom aleinu. Shalom bimroma, v'yaseh
Let us know when it's 8:30. Shabbat shalom, everyone. So good to see you all. Let's thank God for the gift of learning Torah together, and then we'll get right into it. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot b'divrei Torah. V'hayavna Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratcha b'finu ובפי עמך בית ישראל, ונהיה אנחנו וצאצאינו וצאצאי עמך בית ישראל, כולנו יודעי שמך ולומדי תורתך לשמה. ברוך אתה אדוני המלמד תורה לעמו ישראל. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, Asher
Shabbat
Bachar
Banu
Banu
Mikol
Mikol
Amim,
Amim,
Benatan
V'natan
Lanu
Lanu
Et
Et
Torato,
Torato, Baruch
Baruch
Atah
Atah
Adonai,
Adonai,
Notein
Notein
HaTorah. So Shabbat Shalom, everyone, and Shabbat Shalom, Elias and Dan and Michelle and Lisa. We have got a tiger by the tail today. We are talking about an issue that just surfaces all the time, is extremely contentious, it's extremely complicated, it's extremely prismatic of a lot of differences in our society. And I just wanted to have a sober and thoughtful, studied conversation about how it intersects with Judaism. And of course, the issue we're talking about is cancel culture. And two big issues brought it up this week. So, of course, many of us follow the story about John Gruden's emails. He's the coach of the Los Angeles Raiders. He had one of the richest contracts in the NFL. He had signed a 10-year contract worth $100 million. I think he was in the fourth year of it. He had made, or third or fourth year, he had made $30 million. He had another $70 million to go. He was also just generally an ambassador of the NFL, the face of the NFL, the face of the Raiders franchise. And as you all know, a trove of emails came out that he had written between 2011 and 2018. This wasn't one bad email or one dumb thing or 5 bad minutes. This was 7 years worth of hate directed against blacks and women and gays, and just bigotry, horrible. And he got canceled. And by canceled there, meaning he lost his job. So the rest of the 7-year contract, another $70 million. But that's the least of it. It's not just that he lost his job. He lost his Shem Tov, his Keter Shem Tov, the crown of a good name. He lost his place in football. He used to, he lost the places that he was an ad man for. He used to be in Madden PlayStation, a football game. He's off that. He's canceled from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, where he had led the team to a Super Bowl in 2002, and he was in the Ring of Honor in their stadium. He's off the Ring of Honor. He's canceled, right? So one thing I want to think about with you is how do we view that kind of cancellation from a Jewish point of view? The other big story that came out, I'm just going to read it, and it also is part of this cancellation thing, is the way that college campuses are ruled over by a reign of terror by woke people, and that the spectrum of political opinion from left to right is just cut off. Anything center right, you can't say. It's just there's a reign of terror, and you'll be canceled. So I'm just reading this. This is from MIT, a few miles from here. This is from this week. A University of Chicago geophysics professor, geophysics, who was scheduled to deliver a prestigious lecture at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, will instead give his talk online under the auspices of Princeton University after MIT canceled the lecture following a backlash against his political views. Dorian Abbott was supposed to talk about whether the climate of planets outside the Earth's solar system could sustain life. But Abbott's outspoken criticism of college efforts to increase campus diversity, a movement often called diversity, equity, and inclusion, has stirred left-wing outrage, and MIT's decision to scrub the talk has become the latest flashpoint in the debate over free speech. Abbott sparked an outcry last year after posting a series of slideshows on YouTube in which he criticized policies intended to combat racism and sexism in university admissions and hiring. Abbott said he approved of the goals, but he argued the current policies tended to introduce new biases against men and Asian Americans. Abbott also wrote about a conservative Christian student at the university who, according to Abbott, was routinely mocked and ostracized because of his religious beliefs. Quote, "I was arguing that we need to treat each applicant as an individual," said Abbott in an interview. "I also argued that we should try to be open to every point of view on campus." That was a contentious thing to say right now. So in just this week, you have this big football coach gets canceled. He's off the Ring of Honor. And you have a science professor who's canceled and can't talk at MIT because of his views. And he's not, by the way, not against diversity, equity, and inclusion. He argues that the way they're going about it is counterproductive. And so he's canceled. So here's the thing that I want to do with our class today. First, I just want to get at a high level your instinct, your chush, your feel for how cancel culture squares with Judaism. Is it consistent with Jewish values? is it in opposition to Jewish values? We're going to do that at a high level. I just want to go around and whip around. Then I want to do a deep dive into the story of Abraham. I called it Abraham's Worst 5 Minutes. In retrospect, that was an unfortunate title because it's actually Abraham's worst 10 minutes, and it's actually our patriarch's worst 15 minutes because the bad thing that he does, he repeats and then Isaac repeats. I regret that. I want to talk about, and it's pretty horrible what he does, and I want to talk about how you think about that in the context of contemporary culture. And then I want to do a little bit of a deep dive on John Gruden and ask your thoughts about that. So first, high level, your chush, your feel, your sense of cancel culture and its relationship to Jewish values. Michelle, you are always so wise, my friend. Would love your thoughts.
Thank you for putting me up first, Wes. I'm so grateful. Look, I think the term cancel culture is so very politicized, but every person at some level and every society cancels things that they find beyond the bounds, including us as Jews. I think the real challenge is how careful we ought to be with it. I was speaking to my beloved, to Mike, and he actually pointed out to me that there is something in the book of Genesis in Bereshit that we say that we are in the image of God. And if we're in the image of God and we think about the high holidays that we just went through, we see that God actually has the right to judge others. For better or for worse, you are going to be written in the book of life. You're not going to be written in the book of life. Your deeds, you can have repentance or you can't have repentance. Have you done it well enough?
Right.
Okay? So if that's the case, and if we're in the image of God, then we have a little mini right to judge others as necessary in our society as individuals and as a society.
Right.
But like God, we would hope that we would sit on the chair of rachamim
Right.
more often than on the chair of din, the chair of mercy more often than the chair of justice.
Now, Michelle, just before we leave your thoughts, just to probe that for a little bit, would you say that Temple Manual at 385 Ward Street itself, we don't usually use this language, but do we cancel ideas? Do we cancel speakers? Because it's very obvious the answer to that question is yes.
You wanna go there?
So, I mean,
no, it's
if you-
obvious the answer to the question. If you're a BDS speaker, you're not welcome at Temple
Correct.
Manual. If you're a one-state solution person, you're not welcome at Israel.
and that's part of, and
you're
that's
not welcome
exactly,
at Temple Manual. So
and-
we do.
and
we
that's
don't call it
exactly
cancel
part of the
culture,
point,
But we have
correct.
very clear lines that if you're pro BDS, you're not welcome here, and if you're
So that
pro,
means we cancel.
we absolutely.
No, but
do.
I
We
just I want
absolutely-
to
We don't
push.
call it cancel, but we do. By the way, I'm completely supportive of that.
Right.
Whereas
But-
I do not want BDS. BDS to me is hatred. I'm against hatred. One state solution is the abolition of the state of Israel. I'm against that. So I don't want those ideas represented. So I just want to. I mean, I'm taking
So-
you very seriously.
Yeah.
That what you said is we cancel too. We just
Correct.
don't use that word. But we have clear lines about the words that we use are who's in the tent, not in the tent. We have a very big tent. We love our tent. It's a big tent. Get out the tent pegs, like from the Haftarah last week. Get out the tent. We love our big tent. But there are certain ideas that are outside the tent. Obviously, neo-Nazis are outside the tent. The Ku Klux Klan is outside the tent. And BDS and One State Solution, all outside the tent. That's, in effect, canceling ideas. So we do that.
And again, I will make the point that I think when we talk about the politicized version of cancel culture, I think what we're really speaking about is that instinct that does not have a space in it for any nuance or humility.
Right.
That there are ways in which, for example, Derek Brown, who you have brought to our Derek Brown, correct?
Yeah.
Who you brought to our community, the rehabbed Ku Klux Klan member who
Right.
sits at Shabbos tables.
Right.
Now, who is just an extraordinary role model of
Right.
possibility. There's some way in which our cancellation of others has to leave room and possibility
For teshuva.
for tshuva along the way, just as God every high holidays leaves room for our own.
Thank you. Okay. Next speaker on a big sense of cancel culture. Anyone want to take it next? Elisa.
So I want to just. It feels important to say I don't think we cancel to the same extent, Wes, that you were illustrating. I actually think it's one of our biggest communal values is to build the capacity for conversation, especially when we differ, and even more so when we feel like the other side is off in some huge way. Because if we're writing people off, we don't have the possibility of change. And also, I think that within every perspective, even in the perspectives that I most vehemently disagree with, there's a kernel of truth and a kernel of experience that leads to that perspective. And I think that if we can get there, we can make progress. I just want to say, and I want to say, BDS is welcome here. We don't welcome speakers that speak about BDS, but we do welcome congregants who feel like it's really an important part. And we're not saying that anyone who believes that BDS is the right move is out of our tent. What we are saying is that we have a norm that we have in terms of speakers. And I think that's a really important distinction here in terms of this cancel culture. What do you invite in terms of leaders? What do you invite in terms of policy setters? What do you invite in terms of people that we look up to and set up on a pedestal versus the collective communal conversation? And I think that Judaism has real wisdom here because there's deep clarity about the value of opposing viewpoints and the value of having people in the Beit Midrash, in the house of study, who disagree fundamentally and who work together to tease out really important ideas based on that disagreement. There's, machloket l'shem shamayim, that you can really work together for the sake of heaven to piece out truth by working together in opposition. And at the same time, there's also this concept that there are certain things that put you outside. If you murder someone, you have to go to a city of refuge according to the biblical text. You have to go out. You can't be a part of the community. There are sins for which you have to take yourself away because it's just not okay. But that level is so high, and it's not a speech violation. It's an action violation. And I think that's a really important distinction.
Thank you, Lisa. Elias or Dan, your chush on cancel culture and Judaism.
I was thinking more in lines of Torah.
Yeah, go for it. That's
you know,
welcome
like,
too.
so what do you mean like cancel in judging people on their worst day? And so Moshe, he hits the rock. He doesn't go into the land. He's canceled from going to Israel. He's canceled from the Haggadah. But yet simultaneously, he's our hero, he's our leader, he's our teacher. So we have this tension there in that sense of that, and also the stories we're going to study, now about Abraham, the same thing. Our ancestor, the ancestor of three major religions, we'll talk about this later, but he's not canceled. He's
Right.
matter of fact, he's glorified.
Right.
And so so do we in some ways ignore some realities for others, and I think Judaism does that. Like you're talking about the idea that we can hold the whole idea of Mishnah, Gemara, Talmud. That people sit and argue with each other with l'shem shamayim, and where does that? We've always never been able to find an exact cutoff line. There's no real line. It's a movable line of where the cutoff is, where you can cancel and not in that sense.
Yeah. Thank you, Dan. Elias, last word on general sense of things before we get.
Can
into
I
the
go
text.
to my office? I don't want to be here. So there are two different things that I want to bring, and I know that you want to go there later in the class today. It's a huge difference for me what the football coach did that versus the university professor. They are not comparable situations.
Right.
One was horrible for years. The other one, it's different views,
Right.
and I hate that happened.
Right.
Second, Yom Kippur, it's all about, teshuvah, and chozrim liteshuvah, and chatati, and other things. So to what extent and to whom that pardon is granted? I'm a chozer b'teshuvah, for example. I'm all about now study and deep connection with Judaism, no more colorful socks. I'm changed man. After high holidays, I decided, no, this is so superficial, Elias. Concentrate, listen to your colleagues, and do the right thing. Anyway, so I'm a chozer b'teshuvah. I change. But more on a serious note, it's interesting to think about all the source, and constantly we read piyut after piyut in Yom Kippur about teshuvah and about chatati, al-chet, and all the ashamnu, bagadnu, and all that stuff. And then how do we apply it, and to whom do we
Right.
apply that?
Okay. So that's great initial thinking. I want to get into the text. So here's how I would frame it. We're at the beginning this morning's portion of Lech Lecha with the journey. At Lech Lecha, God says to Abraham, as y'all know, go to the land that I will show you, and I'll make you a blessing, and you'll be a blessing to the world. And Abraham at that time no sooner gets there, there's a famine, And I just want to read the story real quick, and then I'm going to give you the gloss of my teacher at the Jewish Theological Seminary, Rabbi Bert Visotsky, who is a professor of Midrash. He wrote a book called Genesis of Ethics, and I'm going to read this. But I'll just to frame it, Bert Visotsky, my teacher at the seminary, says that Abram at the time, pimps his wife, P-I-M-P-S, pimps his wife, and that he engages in a scam in which he uses his wife's sultriness and sexiness and beauty to tempt powerful despots into taking her so that they would then reward him with oxen and camel and all forms of biblical wealth. That's Bert Visotsky's read of the text. So let's look at it. And I want to ask you guys if you think, for just to look at the text on itself, and then we'll plug it back into the longer conversation. But here we are. If you don't have it in front of you, I'll just read it. There was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. If the Egyptians see you and think, she is his wife, they will kill me and let you live. Please say that you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that I may remain alive thanks to you. I just want to double click here on verse 13. Abraham's request to Sarai is two things. Laman yitav li ba'avurech, that it will go well with me, and ve'chayta nafshi biglalech, and I'll be alive thanks to you. So it's two things. I'll be alive, and it will go well with me, okay? When Abraham entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw how beautiful the woman was. Pharaoh's courtiers saw her and praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's palace. And because of her, it went well with Abram. And the Hebrew here is the same Hebrew that links up with what he said. Ula Avram hetiv ba'avura. It went well with him. What does that mean? He acquired sheep, oxen, asses, male and female slaves, she-asses, and camels. And remember, Abram has nothing beforehand. They're starving to death. That's why they had to go to begin with. And now he's a wealthy man, okay? But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his household with mighty plagues on account of Sarai, the wife of Abram. Pharaoh sent for Abram and said, What is this that you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her as my wife? Now here is your wife, take her and be gone. And Pharaoh put men in charge of him, and they sent him off with his wife and all that he possessed. Ve'et kol asher lo, all that he possessed as a result of having passed her off as his wife. Now, we'll get to Bert Visotsky in a minute, because he's got that very spicy interpretation. But what's your, if you didn't have Bert Visotsky, and if you didn't have, by the way, the other sources where this same story recurs, we'll get to that, what would be your interpretation of Abram's ethical conduct in this case?
Question for all my experts, colleagues in Bible. Do we have at any point in Genesis where the phrase, and Abraham loved Sarah exists?
First
No.
love is Rebecca and Isaac.
Sorry?
First
Rebecca
love is
and
Rebecca and Isaac.
No.
He was so sick of his wife. Let's make a profit of it.
So you agree with Bert Wisotsky. So look, whenever I've studied this throughout my life, I've always felt that there's some sense in which Abraham and Sarah, Avram and Sarai, and Abraham and Sarah are really trapped in an ancient culture without many choices. And he makes, an awful choice here, but it doesn't feel to me like he had too many good options. And I appreciated Bert Wisotsky's read. I mean, it's eye-opening. I'll tell you that much. Thinking of him more as a guy who's out to make a quick buck.
Right.
There's certainly no love lost between Abraham and Sarah. That's not the story of a marriage that we get
Right.
with them. And yet, at the same time, I can't help but continue to hold that old read that they're really victims of a society that doesn't give them the option to make good choices here. And the reward that I've always seen is kind of the reward for being seen as somebody who has been afflicted as it were. And interestingly, you can go again and again against these two stories, and then look at the third story that his own son repeats, and you can see that as sort of, this happens again and again, and so you have an intractable culture that they're continuing to encounter no matter where they go, or you can see it as a scam, or you could actually see them as two stories that got kind of, we're telling them again in different ways, but actually perhaps they're really one story, and each of these are taken by commentators over time.
So I'm going to read Bervazatsky and ask if you think, again, he's my midrash teacher at the seminary. Here we go. Wow. Okay, here we go. Could we imagine that this is a scam? That Abraham knows only too well the horror Pharaoh and the Egyptians have of taking another man's wife, and that they would pay a high price for an attractive woman, but an even larger sum of hush money to quiet the scandal of adultery. That Pharaoh's pretensions to divinity forced him to hew to a high moral standard, and that, once entrapped, he would quickly pony up to prevent any breath of scandal. Imagine the cleverness of Abraham pimping his wife. A quick profit is turned, and then a second windfall, as God enters the scene as enforcer. In fact, is Abraham emboldened to this scheme precisely because he knows that God will provide him the muscle to preclude Pharaoh from keeping his wife and killing him? Before you protest that the notion of a scam is too radical a reading, remember that once successful at this type of extortion, Abraham pulls it off again in Genesis 20 with a local king named Avimelech. He too pays off big, sheep and oxen, slaves and maidservants, when he returns Sarah to Abraham. But Avimelech goes even further. He says to Abraham, "Behold, my land is before you. Dwell where you see fit." And then, in case the fact of the scam were not clear, he says to Sarah, "I have given 1,000 pieces of silver to your brother. It is meant to serve as a covering of the eyes for all who are from you." From this second scam, it is all too clear that the cash is for the cover-up. Everyone is bribed to look the other way. The scam is eminently successful. In fact, it's so successful that 6 chapters later in Genesis, Abraham and Sarah's son Isaac imitates the lessons he has learned from mom and dad and repeats the scam with his wife, Rebecca. So, Aliza, do you think Bert Vysotsky's read that this is a scam and that Abraham is pimping his wife, is that harsh and unfair, or do you think it's actually on target?
I think it's totally. I mean, Abraham also
What was your
consistently
answer?
totally on target.
Yeah.
He consistently disregards Sarah's wishes, and I mean, we can look at this moment where he's just like, "Yep, totally worth it for you to be sexually enslaved or go into this harem." And the rabbis are very clear to be like, nothing happens, everything's fine, no one touches her, no one even looks.
She leaves with the baby.
But right, like there's there's some problems that go with that. So from our eyes, she is put in an extremely vulnerable position. She's never consulted. He tells her, "I'm doing this for me. My interests are preeminent, are the most important thing in my eyes right now." But we never hear her voice. We never hear her assent. We never hear if she's good with it. And then he does this again and again, even with taking Isaac to sacrifice him. He does it without her knowledge, without consulting her, knowing that it's going to break her heart. And it seems like the only time he really regards her is when she wishes to put off cruelty onto someone else. And in some ways it feels like the violence that Abraham does to Sarah is something that she extends then to Hagar, and he allows that to happen because he feels like, well, that's what we do. We take advantage of other people for our own self-interest.
So, in other words, if you're generally favorable towards Bert Vysotsky's interpretation, which means that, as you see it, this is not Abraham's worst 5 minutes. This is a pattern. He does this once. He does the exact same thing with Avimelech. You then extrapolate that to just general disregard, like being prepared to kill her son on a mountain as a burnt offering without consulting her, and that this is a pattern, and that Isaac himself, of course, repeats this with Rebecca. So now here's my question, Elisa Gabriela Berger. If that's how you see Abraham, how many times have you said, "Oh, hey, Avraham v'Sarah"? How many times then? And and if what you just said is true, this is like really horrible. This is not regarding, not seeing, pimping, scamming, etc. If that's what you really feel, how then do you always call out the God of Abraham, in your daily Amidah?
It's the God of Abraham, not Abraham. And I think also God doesn't sanction. This is not something that's sanctioned by God. God is, now maybe you could read that God is actually in on the plot because God causes him to be rewarded multiple times. And yes, that's a tough read. I don't like it. I'm like regretting walking into this place in the first
Okay.
place. But I think that when we call on the God of our ancestors, we're calling on the God that was present for our ancestors. We're not saying like Abraham, and there are things I think Abraham can help us with. He's very flawed.
Dan and Elias, I would love your reads on our father Abraham.
So, first of all, I agree that Sarai is really definitely a victim here. On the other hand, I'm just having this like very odd moment where I'm thinking, language is everything in the Torah, and Avram says Imri na, right? It's as though maybe she's actually part of the scam.
Because it's say please.
Because he's saying like you'll please do this, so that sense of language there. I mean, it implies a love relationship. It also implies a connection. This is maybe like too deep a read of the language, but I'm just like taking this idea of the scam and
are you motivated?
Maybe both of them are involved in this scam, and that's
Dan,
why it works twice.
Are you motivated to that very forced reading? Because it's just uncomfortable for you to think that Abraham is such a scoundrel?
No, I'm actually not. I think Abraham definitely is a scoundrel, but I'm playing out all kinds of like possibilities, and maybe this is like there's a combination going on here.
Okay.
I don't know. I mean, maybe it's just a weird read. I don't know.
Elias, how do you see Abraham?
I go back to my original question about love here. There is no love here at all. I mean, you would never do that to your wife that you love.
That is safe to say.
So that's my first take. Second take is I don't think I agree with you then that Sarah says, yeah, let's do it together. But also I think two more things. One, it's a quick reaction that I have to the text about Pharaoh's reaction. It's not bad at all. I mean, when somebody comes to me who is a foreigner and scams me, and I give them possessions and wealth and everything, I wouldn't say, okay, go and keep your belongings. No, give me back all that you took from me because you tricked me. And they escort him out? What? I would kill that guy. Anyways, but also, you're putting a Meir Kahana face. Well, what's going on? Okay.
No, I'm continue.
Yes.
No, but I mean, I think that, yeah, that's one thing. Okay, I lost my line of
Okay, so
thought.
I want to can I just zoom out for a second? Given how problematic we all think Abraham is, once again, you're the defender of our faith, and you find ways to, but for the most part, the consensus seems to be, not just a bad day or bad 5 minutes, but kind of bad character qualities of Abraham. Here's my question. When you zoom out, what does the fact that Abraham is so problematic, and immediately, like it's his first story, like he goes and then boom, this whole Sarah scam. He does it again. He teaches it to Isaac and all the other ways that he disregards Sarah's humanity. And yet, not only is he not canceled, but he is the revered father, not only of our people, but of all people. So I guess my question is, what light does Abraham's inclusion in Mount Rushmore, despite his problematics, what light does that shed on Jewish take on cancellation?
So first of all, I don't buy. I mean, I think Bert Vysotsky's take is really interesting, and it is a very fascinating modern midrash, but it is a modern midrash, and it's bringing our sort of views and beliefs and assumptions about what we expect to see back into an ancient text. I'm not
in
saying
fairness, it's
that
shot because the same
it's
story happens 3 times.
It's actually
Three
not
times.
necessarily pshat, because there are other pshat interpretations, including that this is a piece of non-Jewish culture or non-Israelite culture, non-Abrahamic faith culture out there that actually continues to put people in this kind of a position. And that's why we have our Jewish faith and our Jewish tradition, which is about values. Now, Elias, I totally agree with you. Pharaoh comes out, and Abimelech later comes out looking really, actually like good, pretty decent people who actually
More decent, maybe.
more
So,
like
right.
actually decent. But can I just say
Yes.
there's also a story here about consent. There's also a story here about being a foreigner, about being not part of a culture that is not yours. There's also about being fragile and the wandering Jew throughout time that is always subject to an external government and an external force that's part of the beginning of our story that has actually, I think, many different shot readings out of that. If you're a Jew in Poland and you read this story, you read Abraham as subject to the exact same forces that you were subject to in your time.
Okay. Then let me turn to you, Eliza, because you have no. I'll get to you in a minute, Eliza. But you have, you have the view of Abraham as more morally problematic. I mean, Michelle's just given a different read. What light do you think this sheds on Jewish wisdom on cancel culture? If somebody who's so problematic in all the ways you've described is still the revered patriarch of our people.
So here's the thing, and I think this is totally with cancel culture. We would cancel him if we only look at one set of criteria and one moment of action and one incident. But well, at least what I would hope for in our world is that we would take into consideration the whole person and like really be very thoughtful about whether or not they deserve to be canceled. And while Abraham is a total jerk to his wife, and while he doesn't care about her feelings, he doesn't care about pimping her out, and he feels no qualms about literally making money off of her body, he's also kind of a good guy to his nephew. Like, Lot gets into trouble and he goes into battle for him and he goes to save the day. And for strangers, he's kind of a good guy for strangers. You know, he has no problem standing up to God for strangers. He's not ultimately super successful, but he tries. Like, so he's sort of selectively blind. He doesn't get what it means to be in a loving partnership. He doesn't get how to be a supporting husband, and we see that throughout his life. And when Sarah dies, we see he doesn't really cry. Like, he's just not really there for her. But that doesn't mean he's not there in other ways. And so I think in terms of cancel culture, yes, there's an impetus to be like, we're gonna throw you out for this one thing, and you're beyond the pale. But ideally, we're not canceling people. We're taking into consideration the whole of their character.
So-
we're working with them.
Okay, so Eliza, and I want to just ask you one question to think about, and then Elias, you're up next. I want to pivot for a second to John Gruden, okay? And I want to ask you to imagine that this is a little bit of a counterfactual. You're the owner of the LA Raiders, okay? And John Gruden leaves history now, and he spends X years going to school about how to be a mensch, anti-bigotry school. And he goes to anti-misogyny school, and anti-racism school, and anti-homophobia school. And he does all kinds of justice work. And he comes back saying, I'm utterly ashamed of who I was. Utterly ashamed of who I was. And any number of people who are of the affected communities come and say, this guy is now a mensch. Plus, it turns out he's a really loving husband. And it turns out he's a really loving brother. And it turns out he's a really loving father. And it turns out his grandchildren adore him. And it turns out that your team now has an opening for a football coach. Are you going to hire John Gruden on the basis that, Abraham's complexity is what the Jewish tradition sees, challenging here but very lovely here? What about that? Would you cancel him or hire him?
So if he's done a complete tshuva, and if stakeholders in the community are on board, and if it feels clear to me that he has really reformed and has come clear, I would consider him among other candidates, and I would choose the best candidate for the job. It wouldn't be strictly based on his lack of racism or lack of bigotry or lack of sexism. It would just be like, who is going to be the best person for the job? And I'm not sure. Honestly, being a coach is as much about your skill as the ability you have to motivate players. And so it would really depend on how full his transformation is and whether people would stand behind him.
Elias, your hands
Yeah,
up.
I want to say two things. One is that subjects that we didn't touch. And, we Jewish people are not foreigners to life limit situations where we are about to, extreme situations that we are put only because of our faith. and we've seen it in the Holocaust. So we are reading a text, another view of the text. My first view was love. Another view could be that Abraham is really fearing for his life. And when you think that the only thing that is going to happen is you're going to die, you may go to extreme decisions that otherwise you wouldn't make. Okay? He needs to feel that he is able to survive. He doesn't have anything, and these guys are going to kill him. No, wait, let me finish. Let me finish my thought. Okay? If not, I start talking in Spanish and nobody understands it. So, right. But, we've seen it over and over in history of people who does those kind of things that under normal situation, they wouldn't do it. And I'm not justifying that. I'm seeing that you never know how you, even a man with principles or a woman with principles, is going to react under a certain situation. Okay? That has to be said. Second, I think that our tradition is very, very clear. Our Bible, Torah after Torah, it's full of leaders who have bad things, who have done bad things. Why? This is my take for us to relate. Nobody goes in life from being 100% clean. Saying. That's my view. We all have, how do you like to say, monsters in the closet or something like that?
Yeah.
Anyways,
Yeah.
I strongly believe that. Obviously, super minor or super strong, but I strongly believe that. And that's why Lahazor B'Tshuvah, that's why, the repentance and all that, because they are showing, look, all these guys, David, Abraham, they did horrible things. You can relate to them, and you can still be a good person.
Okay, so Elias, I want to give you a promotion. You're now on the admissions committee of Harvard University. Okay, and the candidate that we're talking about was in the Parkland School in Florida on the day of the shooting, and a number of kids who were in Parkland School on the day of the shooting applied and got into Harvard, and most of them said, as a result of being in the school during the Parkland shooting, I'm all about sensible gun control. Okay, one candidate said, as a result of being in the school on the day of the shooting, I'm very much against gun control. Reducing guns and limiting guns is the wrong move. And he's very conservative, and Harvard, but otherwise qualified and smart. And Harvard's all about diversity, and so they admitted him. Okay, and then, as you may know, then it turns out that his social media was just full of racist stuff. And when that came to light, his offer of admission was rescinded, and he was not allowed to go to Harvard. And now here's my question to you. This kid was canceled, okay? And he's a 17-year-old. He was canceled on the basis of racist stuff that he wrote when he was 17, okay? Part of the ideas circulating in this conversation is, what about teshuvah? What about return? What about everybody has something? You're on the admissions committee. If this guy writes, comes and swears on a stack of Bibles, I was an idiot, I was horrible, I renounced what I wrote a year ago or 2 years ago, and I now see the light, would you let him back into Harvard?
Well, I'm more with Alisa, what she said earlier today, that has to show proof that he has changed. It's not about empty words. It's about actions.
He does hundreds of hours of community service with all kinds of organizations.
So what age are we talking about, 18?
Yeah, he's 18 years old. He wrote something when he was in high school.
We talked about this yesterday. The 18-year-olds, sometimes they said stupid things. I'm not saying that I hate what he said, supposedly. All right? I mean, look at my socks, second chance.
So, okay, so we have 5 minutes left, and I find this conversation very challenging because there's a lot of ideas in it. And also, these kinds of questions always recur. So, on the one hand, it's one thing that we haven't said, and I just want to make the case for cancel culture because I think it's really important, is that calling out John Gruden's racism, calling out Harvey Weinstein's predatory behavior, calling out Matt Lauer's predatory behavior, actually makes for safer working environments and changes the world. Right? In other words, when a society says, thou shalt not molest or harass people who work for you, right? And if you do, you'll have hell to pay. You're going to be shamed. You're going to be publicly humiliated. You're going to lose your job. You're going to lose your good name. It's just not worth it, right? And then you see all these stories of people who that happens to, right? That's a positive step. Right? So and we haven't yet talked about that. Cancel culture has a positive impact. It makes work environments safer. It's a crisp and clear and articulate statement of standards and values that decency requires that you not do this. So I guess I want to ask you, and then on the other hand, this same move that makes work environments safer also makes college campuses much less free as a place of ideas and debate. And I guess my question to you is how, in the end, you see the relationship between this very fraught and problematic and sometimes helpful idea and Jewish values. If you could all just kind of, and then I'll give you my end at the end.
So I think the idea is a good one. In other words, when people are in the wrong, they need to be punished in some way. On the other hand, the pendulum can swing in the wrong direction. So that this guy offered this to speech at MIT. He didn't do anything or say anything that was actually inappropriate, but is looked at as inappropriate, and then he's canceled. So the pendulum swing is really interesting. The other thing I want to just bring up real quickly, is the idea that the NFL actually did bring back someone who was accused of something very horrific many years ago. If you remember Michael Vick. Right, he was basically baiting dogs, dog fighting, right, and he was kicked out of the NFL, and he did teshuva, and he came back.
Went to jail.
He went to jail. He went to jail, and then he was able to come back. Yeah. Now it's different. I think it's different with humans, but it still shows that the sense of cancel culture can swing both ways, and it's again something I said earlier. It's just the idea of where can you make a line? Is the line moving or not?
Thank you.
I want to end asking you a question, my friend. Yeah. This newspaper that you brought for us to read the article denounced this football college, and you can see all many wonderful news that they do. And we haven't talked today about the Duxbury, Massachusetts high school team that had the anti-Semitic slurs for every play that they will do. You may recall that last year, a New York Times Jewish employee resigned because she felt that her voice, she couldn't say what she thought.
Right.
She was canceled.
Right.
How does your thought about better work environment applies to that?
Yeah. So so I think a lot about this. I'll answer your question and we'll end with that. I want to bring a concept that I learned from Daniel Hartman in a different context, but he talks about dance, D-A-N-C-E. He talks about when different ideas are in tension with one another, we don't get an answer, we don't get a resolution, we don't get a definitive conclusion. What you have is a living, fluid dance, and you live with the dance. So on the one hand, there's a lot about cancel culture that I applaud. I applaud a clear articulation of decency. I applaud a clear articulation of boundaries, that certain conduct, like what John Gruden did in his emails, or what Matt Lauer did, or what Harvey Weinstein did, is beyond the bounds of decency. And if you do this, you will have hell to pay. I think that's good for society. I'd want my daughter working in an organization and in a time that is post that. So I'm very grateful to cancel culture for that. On the other hand, what happened to Barry Weiss, what happened to Dorian Abbott, is horrific. And it grows out of that same impulse. So here's how I see it. I see basically kind of two big Jewish values that are in constant competition in this space of cancel culture. And the best thing is a dance. On the one hand, la'asot tzedakah u'mishpat, that is to do justice and righteousness. That's a big Jewish value. God says to Abraham, here's why I've got a covenant with you. You and your descendants are going to be about doing justice and righteousness. And so I feel like to the extent that cancel culture serves that end, then I'm at that part of the dance, I'm good with it. I think it's salutary. I want Jordy working in an environment that is leavened and changed by that. Okay. On the other hand, Aliza, you brought up at the beginning that our whole move is a machloket l'shem shamayim. That people could have a different point of view, and the truth comes out of the conversation. Two Jews, three opinions. Three Jews, four opinions. And in a machloket l'shem shamayim, people have principal difference of opinion, and the fact that the woke movement and cancel culture prevents a whole segment of opinion from even being publicly acceptable, that's now put beyond the boundary. Dorian Abbott's views. He's not even against diversity and inclusion. He's just arguing for a different way to accomplish it. That is obviously horrible. Horrible. Machlok l'shem shamayim. So it's a dance. Tzedakah u'mishpat. If something is, I think what happened to John Gruden this week is good. It's good for our country, and it's good for our world, and it's good for football. And I think what happened to Dorian Abbott this week is terrible for the university and terrible for our country. So how do we balance justice and righteousness, lasot tzedakah mishpat, and how do we balance that against a machloket l'shem shamayim, free marketplace of ideas? And by its nature with cancel culture, because it's so big and it's so important, there's no one answer. There is a dance, and we always have to look at every case on its facts. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Right. You know, when the light is off, I'm on the dark. I'm completely in the dark.